Well, we are going to engage in a very short, brief panel discussion, and then we'll open it up to questions from the audience. We have a couple of interns who are roving with the mics. If you could raise your hand, show yourself. So if you would just raise your hand, and we'll get the mics in place. So you mentioned that the task force was on an accelerated time schedule, and the question that came to my mind was, these are great recommendations. Is there anything that you think you would have done differently or changed if you'd had more time?
Should we each answer that? I'm not, on behalf of the capacity subcommittee, I think we were pretty much in agreement. And I'm not sure we would have come to any different conclusions had we had more time. So I don't feel like we compromised our work in any way.
Yeah, we spent 2 really solid days in DC working together. Most of us on the subcommittee were able to attend, and we had already individually sort of thought about different aspects. I think the one thing that we might have done more of, that we did do some of, but we would have increased, is talking to people who are currently on the Hill, both formally and informally. We did some of that, but I think more time would have given us more opportunities for those types of valuable discussions.
I don't think I would change anything. My team was very collaborative, and we, as I mentioned, we really had to kind of work on the fly to even sort of think how to think about our topic, and it was really an amazingly fruitful and intellectually interesting exercise. We spent the summer on it and ended up writing an 80-page long document that was the underlying memo for and then Francis and Eric were upset with us because it was 80 pages. So they made us make it shorter. But this has been just a truly amazing experience. Yeah.
That's great. From your perspective as the co-chair, were you satisfied with the timeline?
I'm amazed that it came together. I mean, that everybody was operating on a volunteer basis, and so to get people to write and to do the deliberation and to do this research and to assist in this way, we just had to rely on their public spiritedness and their goodwill, and that's not always a safe bet, but it happened to work out in this case.
That was such an important topic.
Yeah. Well, we all care about Congress.
Yeah.
Certainly modeling civility and collaborative. So in the kind of academic atmosphere where you're thinking about problems, and obviously these are issues that you've been thinking about for a long time, you've been writing about, you've been working on, in the canon of political science research, these are issues that have existed for a long time. So if you look at this kind of disconnect between the practice of politics and the kind of theoretical understanding of politics, why are we still having this conversation, or why is there still this trouble in accepting these recommendations or making the changes that the academics think are necessary?
You mean, like, why doesn't Congress just take our report and enact it?
Yes.
Yeah. I don't even know if they've read our. I hope they've read it. The problem of the challenge is they don't have time to read and think about these things. I think that the Modernization Committee is a rare bright light in Congress actually having the time to think about itself, and it's for its importance in our society. It's an incredibly unreflective institution at most times. So I think that's part of the challenge, and part of the challenge is that there are politics underlying all of this, and just because we agree doesn't mean that enough members of Congress are going to agree that these are good ideas, because it might change how they operate.
Right. I think my subcommittee was both very attuned to partisan politics and political realities, but also tried very much to take into consideration best practices and what EEOC guidelines and sort of human resource experts from outside the institution. So sort of a combination of what really makes sense, what are best practices, and then what would have bipartisan support? You know, what wouldn't alienate one of the two parties? And sort of, you know, separating the House Diversity and Inclusion Office from partisan politics, making it permanent, sort of things like that with political realities in mind.
So I'll say the select committee staff has been great to work with. I don't know how much you all have interacted, but my group interacted with them quite a bit, and it's just been an absolute pleasure working with them. And I think that they're very intellectually engaged in the political science of this, but then they need to bring things to the members. And the way the select committee is moving forward is the way Gilmer and Graves are moving forward is cautiously in the current environment. That's sort of the best that they can do, and they're doing it well. But I don't think the staff can just push everything in front of them. I think that they need to sort of curate what kinds of things that they're showing to the members that make it so that the committee can move forward in the way that they aspire it to move forward. So it's kind of a tough time to be doing congressional reform right now. Yeah. So, but I think I'll tell you, the staff have just been fantastic to work with, and they're super smart.
Do you feel that from the technology perspective, that seems to be the most obvious place where, you know, as you call the pacing problem, is observed, that members who are constantly on social media and connected in many different ways, that's probably a more pressing reform than, say, staffing, diversity, or capacity?
So if you look at the recommendations the select committee has made so far, and quite a few of them have been about technology, and they have even said that they need to revamp the House Information Resources Office. But I think what we are pushing for is kind of it's bigger than, it's sort of a change in how the organization functions. And I don't think that's kind of the pitch that we're making to them, that we're not really going to solve the technology problem until that underlying organizational problem is solved. And that's a big ask. So I think they're very attentive, and they've had hearings on technology. They've made a number of recommendations on technology, but I think we would like to see them go a little bit farther.
Francis, I wonder, we only heard from 3 subcommittees, the subcommittees that could find consensus. So there are 3 subcommittees that had a much more difficult time. I wonder if you might say a few words about those challenges.
Well, the other 3 subcommittees dealt more with internal organization and procedure. So we had a budget and appropriations subcommittee, a subcommittee on committee processes, legislative process, focusing on, you know, the departures from regular order that have become very prevalent in how Congress operates, and then a subcommittee on the calendar, and dealing with issues of, you know, how little Congress is in town, members are here, and how that gets in the way of Congress's ability to do legislative work, and whether there are imbalances relative to Congress's representational role. So those were the questions that were dealt with. But all of those committees confronted very serious trade-offs that made it very difficult for them to make recommendations along the lines of what were presented today. Instead, it was an analysis more of, well, if we do this, these are the following implications. So in the case of the congressional calendar, the severe trade-off there, of course, is representation versus lawmaking. And members confront realities where they're expected to be in their constituencies. Their constituents expect them to be there. In a world of jet travel, you don't have an excuse not to go home anymore. We're not in a position to tell elected officials the right way to do their job. So we lay out the trade-offs and the difficulties associated with the calendar as it currently exists. And that's what each of those other 3 committees needed to do. With regard to departures from regular order in the legislative process, those frequently happen because the regular order results in impasses that have to be dealt with at a leadership level. And so if the legislative process, the regular order process, is not working, then Congress needs to do something differently. Now that has trade-offs. So those aspects of the report that are informative of the dilemmas, institutional dilemmas that Congress faces but we didn't reach a set of recommendations. Generally speaking, there's some smaller scale recommendations in those sections of the report, but those are tough issues for good reason.
Right. Sort of harks back to something that Lee, you mentioned in your remarks about the challenge being that you're asking political parties, in essence, to give up power. And this is a human organization. It's a constitutional institution, but it's made up of human beings. And so to the extent that human beings are responsible for these decisions, either to go along with the party leadership or to defect from the party leadership, these are challenges, particularly in the House, that we observe. So to the extent that the recommendations you're offering or suggesting really challenge the parties to give up some measure of power, how realistic?
How realistic
how
are they?
realistic is it?
I mean, the parties have power because the members give the party leaders power, and if members collectively say, we want more power for ourselves, or we want committees to have more power, they can do that. I mean, the challenge is that there's a reason that a lot of members want to delegate a lot of power to party leadership. Either they don't want to take the responsibility of legislating themselves, or they think party leaders are best empowered to deliver the policies that they would like to see. So there's a lot of belly aching on Capitol Hill about how individual members have no power, or Mitch McConnell has too much power, Nancy Pelosi has too much power. But they have power because the individual members delegate that power to them. And so ultimately, Congress does what its members collectively want to do. So its members have to collectively say, we want to have power elsewhere than leadership. And until they do that, I mean, it's not going to magically happen on its own.
And at the individual member level, increasing staff capacity and staff diversity, I mean, sure, that may give an individual member a little more legislative oomph to challenge a party leader, but it could also help them with constituent services and a whole host of other things that wouldn't necessarily be a challenge to party leaders that hopefully members on both sides of the aisle could agree would be good for both congressional capacity and their own individual careers.
Mm-hmm. In terms of the cycle, you kind of alluded to this a little bit, the push for greater party leadership control over the committee process was itself a kind of reaction to exercise of power on the part of the committee leaders. So do we think that if these reforms are adopted, that at some point in the future we're going to be having a different conversation? Is this a cycle? And if it's a cycle, then what's the time frame for the next reform conversation?
Probably it is a cycle. I mean, the last time we had incredibly centralized leadership control was in the late 19th century, early 20th century, and then there was a revolt against strong leadership, and then Congress became more and more decentralized over time until it was too decentralized. And the member says, there's no order to this. We need to delegate more power to leadership. Now everybody's complaining there's too much power to leadership. At some point, that probably collapses, and then I think you're right. Then there's some period in which we're have a kind of golden middle period in which we're transitioning to something, and then Congress is constantly changing, and it's always reacting because you can't. I think underlying all of these reports is that there are trade-offs, and you can never get those trade-offs entirely right. You can just hope to overcorrect when you've steered too far in one direction.
But these recommendations don't get us to the place where committees were sort of in the age of committee power before the reforms of the 1970s. Definitely. One of the reforms from Molly Roberts' subcommittee that was not mentioned was actually to repeal term limits on committee chairs because of the problems that has led to in terms of diminishment of expertise in the chair and retirements and whatnot. But that was not discussed, but even that would not return us to sort of the age of the committee chair that we saw prior to the 70s.
So one thing that's interesting from the perspective of our subcommittee is that that people tend to take the way Congress is the way that it's always going to be. And it's interesting for technology that people have such low expectations that Congress can use technology. They can't even envision a Congress that uses technology to perform in a different way. And so, in fact, not to disclose too much, but during our September meeting, we had a long discussion about calendaring, that's, as Frances mentioned, where people were agonizing about this trade-off between the time you spend in your district with your constituents, but that you're not lawmaking in DC. And one of my subcommittee members, and I was thinking about it too, that's a terrible trade-off. And then one of my subcommittee members, Claire Abernathy, mentioned, well, they could use technology to at least solve some of that. So if they're in the district, they can use Zoom, to meet with their colleagues in DC to work on legislation, or there's a number of us on the subcommittee are working on is new technology for constituent engagement, where they can better engage their constituents using technology from DC. And so you could actually use technology to solve some of these long-standing problems. But the problem is that it's hard to even think of it's hard to envision Congress using technology because it so persistently doesn't currently use it. And so we tend to think of it as, well, that's just the way it's always going to be. But that's kind of something that we're hoping that we can kind of get people to think different. Yeah.
The final thing I wanted, and then we'll get to the audience questions, the final question I had for the panel is, how do you measure success? How do we know that these reforms are working if they're adopted?
No, go.
I mean, our recommendations are pretty specific. So I think, to the extent that they're fulfilled, to the extent that, the House Diversity and Inclusion Office does maintain a website and do outreach, and that there are data that are collected from each office, which includes this information, that are machine readable. I mean, sort of so that each metric is achieved. That would be progress.
I think the bar right now is pretty low for Congress playing a more active role in our political system. So I mean, I think seeing Congress engage more in its constitutional role of actually being a source of policy innovation and genuine oversight of the executive branch would be a success. So I think basically, anything that is better than what we have now would be a success. But I'd like something greater than that too.
I teach policy evaluation at my university, and so evaluation sort of that's kind of built into the plan of kind of developing metrics and what counts as a success as part of what our recommendations. Yeah.
That's great. We can go to audience questions. Yes, sir, in the back.
Thank you. I'm Peter Shotley, and I ran the Brookings Legis Fellows program for 12 years. We're in the middle of a presidential election, and there's fierce opinions on both sides. It's also a congressional election, and I think many of us would agree that Congress is broken. Why is there no large public outcry to fix Congress? I hear almost nothing. It's almost silent, and we're at an 11 or 12% approval rating. How come?
One answer to that paradox is that we elect individual members of Congress who are not responsible for Congress as an institution. In fact, in many cases, these individual members run against the institution that they then serve in. So no one is accountable for Congress as a whole. That may be one of the reasons for Congress's failure to invest in itself on many fronts, because members don't see their interest as fully aligned with the institution. They're not accountable for the institution's outcomes. They're accountable to their constituents for impressing them with the good job that they do, for the positions that they take, for the votes that they cast, but not for the performance of Congress as a whole.
What about the leadership?
Yeah. The leadership are not accountable for Congress. They are accountable to the constituencies that put them in their position, the members who put them in their position. So again, it's still not an institutional accountability on the scale of what would be needed for the public outcry. Who do you blame for Congress as a whole? There isn't a single site of responsibility for that.
In the back.
Hi, thank you for your work. So do you think in that respect, that gerrymandering or how the Congress uses their time would be the bigger issue in terms of them being able to look at this and want this work that you've done? And one other question, are you going to follow up?
We didn't pursue electoral reform as part of our effort because it was not within the scope of the issues outlined for the Select Committee on the Modernization of Congress. That helped to guide our effort. I mean, there are many topics in congressional reform that even though this is a lengthy report, that we did not tackle. And electoral reform, campaign finance reform, those were both beyond the scope of what we dealt with. Well, we have fulfilled our mandate to the American Political Science Association as of this juncture, so that's an ongoing question. Yeah.
There's a question here for throw in, yes.
Hi, good afternoon, and congratulations on this work. A part of your recommendations for the Diversity and Inclusion Office have already been adopted. The House has approved the hiring of a Diversity and Inclusion Officer. She is in place.
Oh, good.
And so congratulations to the work that you've done. Take credit for it. But now the question is, rallying, 500 plus members and getting them to abide by and even have an interest in diversity, inclusion, and equity. Do you have any, recommendations or suggestions for the person who's stepping into this role? And it's not me, by the way.
Thank you. Yes, when we met in June, the office had been created, but it was not yet staffed. And one concern that we had was that Democrats came into Congress and created this, and we wanted to make sure that it was permanent, would remain in the next Congress, no matter who has majority party control, and that it would get enough resources so that as its role would expand, it wouldn't just be one person. But it is a tough job. But I think one of the reasons why we started with the necessity of collecting good demographic data from every office and putting it online in a machine-readable format, and then having the Chief Administrative Office presenting it to the Appropriations Committee every year, so that there was much greater awareness and much greater transparency. And then hopefully members would be incentivized to go to the Diversity and Inclusion Office and come up with a plan if their office wasn't very diverse. And in addition, I sort of went quickly through some of the recruitment and hiring. We also recommend a searchable database where job candidates could voluntarily include demographic information. They would not be required to, but they could, so that if members were trying to improve the diversity of their office, they could no longer say, well, we don't know where to find diverse candidates, because in fact, candidates could disclose this information in a central way as well. And so at the end of the day, members still have to be incentivized to make changes politically, but we're hoping, and sort of personally, but we're hoping that all of these recommendations would really help in that process, along with a permanent and sufficient appropriations to the office.
We'll come here to the front. To the third row in. This gentleman here. Thank you.
An observation and a question. I'm an APSA member, and I was a Brookings fellow during Watergate. The observation is that many countries that we may all be familiar with have this sort of Luddite predilection in terms of technology and government, which protects to a certain degree the members who are in place, stability. And it seems to me that it might be worth considering that. If Congress members could have anything such as software that could communicate with their constituents easily, then their constituents could have it almost instantaneously. And it would be like them having a machine or a gun that could shut everybody else up. If you could say, they can have it alone, it'd be fine. But if you make it Congress-wide, then the other 537 members have it. And it is destabilizing because right now they don't have equal resources and distribution. So it's a consideration. The question, however, is about something that is more behavioral than theoretical, less unbehavioral. You pointed out that the departure point for the task force was the evident decline of congressional assertiveness and the submission to things from the imperial presidency. You didn't say that, but I'm assuming that to war powers, et cetera. And so I'm simply not about the environment politically, but about the behavior of Congress at points in your study, in committees and elsewhere, when people decide to, toe the line of the White House or anything else. Are there any references or conditions that indicate concession? I mean, so for the moment, we see a lot of things going on, but are there some common denominators that you have observed in your collections of background reading or in your actual interviews that might give an indication of what processes at committee level or elsewhere indicate Congress is about to bend over?
We'll go to you next. Go ahead.
Well, with respect to the your question about about Congress's assertiveness relative to the executive branch, we did not take as our position as the goal of our task force to increase Congress's power relative to the executive branch. We wanted to help Congress work better by its own lights, whatever those are. So you don't prescribe to Congress how it should use its powers, but Congress can work more effectively according to the goals that it sets for itself. We looked to the Select Committee's jurisdiction. What are the issues they see a pressing need to work on? So we want Congress to be able to play its co-equal role in the constitutional system. But we didn't prescribe that Congress needs to check the executive branch to a greater extent than it currently does. That we saw that as a political matter beyond the scope of our work.
A quick point on the technology point. So my colleague Brad Fitch is here from the Congressional Management Foundation, and they produce these reports that show how already offices are fully inundated with electronic communication from constituents. And so what a number of us are working on, and what we worked on, and we mentioned in our report, is a number of us are looking for technology solutions that enable members' offices to extract better insights and to really understand sort of the nature of communication that they're getting, to sort of, because they're already inundated, so maybe to find ways to help them with that. Yeah.
I'm going to have two, if we can have two questions, and then if you can ask the questions and then answer them, and this lady here, and then in the middle. Sorry.
Thank you very much, and thank you for your efforts. I'm beginning to understand that your task force was more on internal procedural attempts to better Congress. I do have a question. Which subcommittee, if any, addressed perceived legislative corruption on the Hill originating from lobbying influences? Was there any subcommittee that addressed that?
I would say two. Oh, sorry.
Oh no, go ahead.
Two subcommittees spoke to that. The Congressional Capacity Subcommittee was very concerned with lobbying influence. And one of the reasons why Congress should seek to beef up its internal capacity to evaluate policy proposals is so that it would be less reliant on outside sources of information like lobbyists. So it's in the background, but it was not. We did not advance proposals around lobbying regulation. That also not being within the scope of the issues referred to the Select Committee. The work on the Congressional the Subcommittee on staff retention and diversity also dealt with issues of internal management, where there have been a number of scandals on the Hill relating to management of staff that their recommendations would speak to and help to address going forward.
Last question.
Yeah, Don Wolfensberger, former Hill rat and current think tank cellar dweller. A political scientist recently wrote, I can't remember who it was, that Congress really isn't interested in beefing up its capacity for problem solving and policy making, that it's really driven by the re-election imperative. And I think you can see this reflected in the hires that members have and leadership have, more communications experts for messaging and fewer policy experts. So I'm very much sympathetic with what you all are trying to get at. Congress should do a better job of identifying our problems and solving them, but are they really interested in doing what we think they should be doing?
I think some members are and some members aren't, but I think that the problem is that there are a lot of folks in this country who might want to run for Congress, and then they look at what the role of a member of Congress is now, and they say, you know, I got better things to do. I'm not going to tear my family apart, and spend half the time in Washington, and So I think part of the challenge is there's a sort of chicken or egg dynamic here, which is you want to build a Congress that attracts people who are seriously interested in policy, but you can't do that until members are willing to invest in the resources that it would take to attract those kind of people. And we're on the opposite downward spiral in which people who are interested in serious policy making are retiring and leaving. And the people who come are just people who want to be on TV more and more.
Right, and the same dynamic is true at the staff level. So with better training, better pay, people who really want careers as policy experts in Congress, hopefully that would help improve the staff as well.
Well, we are out of time, and I know that there are other questions. This is a relevant issue. Any last words? I want to thank you all for coming. Thank you for your interest and your support.
Thanks for watching. Be sure to like and subscribe for more videos from Brookings.